Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here at this amazing time in our history when things are happening. And I want to talk, in the earlier presentation of Elena, we talked, and the background noise was about EU values. We've invested so much with Erasmus and other programs on promoting EU values. And over the last 30 years, inclusion has been put forward as one of those values. However, it's easy to support inclusion when you don't know what it means. It's easy to support inclusion when it's a cliche or a nice phrase. I also work as an evaluator with the European Commission. And as you know, every Erasmus application and every other application has to contain some perspective on inclusion that the project proposal will address. And time after time, I can smell the cut and paste of somebody simply giving words, token acknowledgement. There's something they want, give it to them, without any understanding of what inclusion means. This is not about those who are excluded. It is about changing the mainstream to acknowledge that exclusion is a critical part of the way we forge our societies. One of the issues is that I approach this from a slightly critical viewpoint. I work at the intersection, I and my colleagues, of human rights, of strategic change and vision of higher education throughout Europe, but also further afield, particularly in the Middle East and in the Far East. We work with developing countries. We work with early childhood education. My colleague Imelda here is a specialist on that. And we work centrally from the experience of diversity and inclusion as a key aspect of social transformation. So what I want to do in this is to try and review a number of issues. In the paper, this is extended, I hope, in a coherent format, but I want to talk about some of the issues and themes that should be exercising our minds now. First of all, as you all know, over the last 5 months, we have had a concerted, specific, and targeted attack on the very use of the words diversity, equity, and inclusion. In certain circles in the United States, DEI is seen as a slanderous word. To refer to any woman in a senior position, to refer to a person of color, to refer to a gay politician as being a DEI hire reaches a nadir of abuse that is simply unacceptable. We have seen, connected with this, a generalized erosion of rights-based perspectives. And I am concerned from the point of view of Europe, where we stand. If our understanding of inclusion is superficial, we will not be able to resist this onslaught. I'm not surprised by the onslaught, by the way. I grew up in the United States. A long time ago, I realized there were challenges of what I was facing, and that was Reagan. I thought it couldn't get worse. And the reason I'm saying this from a European point of view, we've already seen on the green agenda, as we will see today, a pulling back. We've seen the Europe that promotes peace, remilitarizing. We've seen a Europe that would see inclusion as a cost, as something that can be saved. So if we are committed to this concept, we need to be engaged in the struggle to assert it in our proposals and in our actions at a profound and sustainable level. We have enduring impacts of our histories of discrimination and segregation. The reason we have an inclusion dynamic at all is because we have brought with us from the past powerful traditions of exclusion and of victimization of others. And therefore, we need to understand that when diversity and inclusion became integral components of educational reform, this has continued over the last 30 years fairly successfully in terms of enshrining in numerous international frameworks the concept that inclusion is beneficial for all of us. Okay, and I'm talking particularly about the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. But an inclusive and equitable quality education should be a foundational pillar for sustainable development. And that magic word that we seem to have dropped, which is social justice. and the implications of that. So diversity, equity, and inclusion is not merely a policy preference, but a globally endorsed standard for advancement of human rights, democratic citizenship, and institutional accountability. Inclusion, if it is to mean anything, has to be the basis for legislation, for practice, and for standards. Not an optional tack-on, but a real essence of what we are doing. And I say this because there are 4 crises that have shaped us over the last 15 years or so that I think are beginning to echo with a speed which is quite extraordinary. The first was the financial collapse, the market collapse in 2008, which was echoed on with a subsequent crisis later on, about 10 years ago. This has not gone away. The second one, I think, would be the impact of COVID. And those of us involved in distance education will know how revolutionary that has been. But it also highlighted a crisis in terms of our understanding of public health and our responsibility. We see with the current Secretary of Health in the United States how surreal this can become when you deny scientific reality, as was done by his boss in the first term, okay? And millions die, and we don't assimilate the learning from that. This was not the last pandemic we will face. The third thing, I think, is this question of technology and the profound impact. I understand that this and many conferences are dominated by AI, and I take a nice neutral stance on this. It is unfolding, it is important, but we're seeing AI applied specifically in the growth of the authoritarian state, okay, the intrusion, and we abandon again principles of privacy, of security of data, and this is happening at an alarming rate. And the final thing would be what we are facing in Europe in very open sense, which is the growth of the extreme right and the growth of xenophobia and racism, and sometimes being echoed by establishment parties. What is happening in Hungary and Slovakia, 2 members, okay, is not acceptable. But I'm afraid they're not the first, and they're certainly not going to be the last. So these series of crises begin to impact on us in a very powerful way. So let's look at some of the global characteristics here. We've seen that diversity, equity, and inclusion are embedded in educational forms, and all EU and international trends, so that there is both resistance to this in real terms, but also great support as people see the changes, okay? The transformation towards a knowledge society, which is a bedrock issue in terms of EU policy, is linked to a set of processes and elements that for the first time in history, they're explicitly and consciously global. Although we have strong and powerful forces trying to turn things back to a national perspective, the fact is we have moved into a global environment, and we will sink or swim according to that definition. Therefore, the complete integration of aims, beliefs, aspirations, and knowledge into one standardized system would be fatal to human creativity, but also what we value as a democratic process. How can we keep that diversity, but at the same time understand it at a global perspective? And therefore, a key role for those of us as educators is to analyze the contradictions and conflicts in societies, and societies which are shaped by inherent inequalities of the prevailing socioeconomic system. We cannot talk about this glibly. We live in a democracy, do we? What does that mean? What does that mean for everybody? And that's the ecological, psychological, and social dimensions of crisis become increasingly apparent. It is essential for us as educators to rediscover and to assert critical thinking capacity. Now, there's a lot of text up here. Please forgive me. I should be able to put it on. The interaction between technology and globalization has created new challenges, but also new opportunities. I would feel that digitalization, what we're going through this era, is a potentially democratizing force, but it also has the ability to concentrate extraordinary power in fewer and fewer hands. And this is a profound risk if we are not aware. and if educators are not aware, then this will fall. For higher education, the traditional roles are challenged, okay? Power systems, functions of the academy, and removing the elitism which is still inherent in such restricted systems. Those of us working with universities will realize there is a shift in the tectonic plates. And this is not over, and over the next 30 years, we will see this move into a whole new dimension. So let's go back to when inclusion became fashionable. At the end of the Second World War, the network of policies, which were about security and order, as proclaiming a new democratic capitalism, which was triumphant, had emerged. The devastation of that war, the lingering effects 80 years ago, has been answered by a set of institutions and movements which were designed to prevent that happening again and to correct grave errors of the past. And yet we can see 80 years later, this is unraveling. It's unraveling, not necessarily surprising, but the speed with which it's unraveling is. At almost every level, Western universities over the last 20 years, 40 years, have not supported the transformative socio-political upheavals of the 1960s. Universities, in large part, have lost the digital race, ceding ground to more innovative and expanding high-tech companies. Lacking critical insight or technological relevance, many universities fell into serving national roles and functions. Over the last 5 appalling months of lies and distortions, the one thing that has affected me probably most deeply has been the collapse of noted American universities before threat and bluster and bluff. Basic things like student security, like the rights of people to protest, have been undermined, and universities being threatened with money seem to produce a change that being threatened with inclusive policies never did produce. Where does this come from? What is the background of this? Environment is about other people and relationships between people in the social structure in terms of interaction, power, and hierarchy. Issues and elements around design and inclusion and access are the foundation of those concepts of social justice. A social justice which emphasizes as its operating principles fairness, inclusion, and equitable distribution of resources. This is where the soup become out and have been shaped very strongly by that experience, by one of the most neglected populations in terms of human rights and participation. What are the trends? DEI roots in post-World War II, military reform and civil rights movements. The global adoption of UN SDGs I already talked about. Diversity management came from the United States military. This is a surprising fact for most people. But the United States found itself in 1941-42 thrust into a world war with an army, an air force, a navy, which is polarized on racial lines. An army cannot, a military force cannot operate on that basis. And on that basis, as an urgent demand of the president, the need was how do we get people who hate each other to work together? And it's on that basis that diversity management rose. And after the war was taken up by industry, which I think is interesting. There was corporate leadership of companies that saw the idea of people working together harmoniously, even if they were still racist or sexist or whatever. That was a personal problem. But once you're here, you conform to this. And this is specifically the fact that is being rolled back now. And I think it's really interesting that companies did this, led on it, and companies like universities are also caving in. The pioneering role of the disability movement needs to be acknowledged. And to my horror, but joy, only this week, you had the spectacle of disability activists, some of whom I know, being arrested in Washington, being chained to their wheelchairs and carted off to jail for asking again for basic rights and being denied and called subversive. Modern public education systems incorporate social justice principles. And they do this through policies, multicultural curricula, and anti-discrimination legislation. things like culturally relevant pedagogy, restorative practices for those who have suffered, not Afrikaner farmers, but the people who did suffer, and finally, the critical pedagogy. As you know only too well, social justice and pedagogy was pioneered by people like Paulo Freire in Brazil and Dewey. The focus on these things goes back. And in the United States, this became a powerful element in terms of the civil rights movement in terms of the 1950s and 60s. A struggle that was incredible. I don't know if anybody has ever been to Memphis. Anybody here? I know some have. If you ever go to Memphis, please, you can go to Elvis Presley's house, of course, go to the National Civil Rights Museum. It's in the Lorraine Motel, where Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968. His bedroom has been left exactly as it was, including with the cigarettes and the ashtray. And he stood there. And this was a critical moment when you look at the exhibition of the struggle for basic recognition of Black people in the United States for human rights. This hasn't gone away. Initially centered on race and ethnicity, the movements of the 60s broadened out to look at other things around language. Far cry from that to now making English the official language. Disability, sexual orientation, religion, and all these things had a powerful impact in many countries, including my own and in Ireland, where they formed the basis of the civil rights struggle, which began in the 1970s. I grew up in California, and to my great surprise, was arriving in Ireland at 19, 20 years old, and hearing people on the streets marching to "We Shall Overcome." I'm thinking, wow, I thought I left that behind. No, this rippled throughout everything. Rooted in historical struggles for justice, informed by understanding that equity, this is what brings us to an effective understanding of inclusion. Now, I want to bring this back to Europe. And I want to look at Europe because I have grave concerns that Europe can simply imitate the mistakes being made at a catastrophic level in the United States and elsewhere. We have challenges in Europe we sometimes paper over around our labor diversity, around migration, quality laws. We have strong policies, great words, but the reality is this is fraying at the edges. The European Union has produced a strong emphasis on common standards, both to affirm rights and to regulate workforce conditions. And remember, the authority of the EU extends only to two areas: free movement of labor and free movement of capital. Nothing else. It has no authority in education. It can promote best practice. It can suggest ways that people can exchange, but it can't influence national policies. This is a critical weakness. Okay, there remains a gap between the legal prohibition of discrimination and the actual outcomes for those people who are disadvantaged. We watch with alarm the growth of sink communities in our suburbs, from Paris, okay, across to other areas, Barcelona, and the associated racism with that. The extension of equality of rights and citizenship becomes a fundamental question for Europeans' policy. And my worry is that the European retreat from rights-based diversity is going back to this simple token acknowledgement. When we say we want inclusion, prove it. The current crisis, I won't dwell on too much. I think I mentioned already, you see my biases, okay, in the US, really takes some time to analyze. Legislative bans, powerful coordination with certain states, those beacons of academic excellence like Alabama and Mississippi, funding threats. If you don't do what we tell you, we'll take away your money, or we'll arrest you for being elected governor. Academic self-censorship. The MAGA movement in the United States has escalated a systemic campaign against DEI. And to my appalled awareness, and I think my colleague will confirm this, United States embassies in Europe have coordinated a campaign of writing to educational bodies and to employers saying, remove any reference to diversity, equity, or inclusion in your policies, or we will withdraw any cooperation with the United States. This is a gross attack our basic confidence. And my worry is not that Europe is fighting back on this, but saying, well, we'll do our best. A coordinated international campaign, and that's what this is, threatens not only the rights of historically marginalized groups, but also what we have in our public education systems. This is no more and no less than an assault on the public good. And we need to be able to look at this, that finally inclusion is about giving meaning to the struggle for participation. It is not just about including those who are different. It is about changing the mainstream itself. The process of inclusion is meant to change everybody, not just give token benefits to the few. You can read this later. I'll skip over that. I'm going backwards on this. I have a conclusion. I would suggest that diversity, equity, and inclusion are the cornerstone of democracy and innovation. The great innovations we have in this world from disability alone are extraordinary. From everything like certain materials that we have, Gore-Tex, for example, for wheelchair users, Velcro developed for that, to things like UDL itself, pioneered by communities of people with disabilities. Access denied is the same as rights denied. Equal citizenship takes access to the next level, which is active participation. By challenging legacies of segregation, and this is critical in Europe, which has a powerful and malign history of colonization for most countries. I was thinking last night, thank God Ireland is not in NATO. This really sets rights in a particular context and remains a critical determinant today in the rights of people with disabilities, migrants, refugees, and that great majority still excluded, women. I don't know if we have time for questions, but I would like to thank you for your attention on this, and maybe we can start a dialogue between ourselves and we can assert inclusion as a right and not as a token. Thank you.